Something happened between Canada and the United States that instantly grabbed international attention. And within hours, political commentators were arguing about it. News organizations were covering it, social media was exploding over it. And millions of people were asking the same question. Did Mark Carney really just tell Donald Trump to go to hell? Because if you only saw the headlines, that's exactly what it looked like. And once the story started spreading, it spread fast, very fast. The confrontation quickly became one of the most talked about political stories online. Supporters called it a powerful act of defiance. Critics called it reckless political theater. Others argued the entire moment was being exaggerated by media and social networks. But regardless of where people stood politically, everyone was suddenly paying attention. And that's what made this story different. This wasn't just another disagreement between two politicians. It wasn't another routine diplomatic dispute, and it certainly wasn't another forgettable news cycle. Because underneath the headlines, something much bigger was happening. The relationship between Canada and the United States was already under pressure. Trade disputes, tariff threats, economic uncertainty, political friction, months of tension had been building beneath the surface. And eventually, that pressure had to go somewhere. Then came the moment that changed everything. A public confrontation, a direct challenge, and a message that immediately became headline material. Because according to reports and the narrative that quickly exploded across media coverage, Carney appeared unwilling to back down from what many Canadians viewed as increasing pressure coming from Washington. Not economically, not politically, not publicly. And that's where Donald Trump entered the center of the story. Because whether people support him or oppose him, Trump has built a reputation around negotiation through pressure, escalation, leverage, public strength. His supporters see it as effective leadership. His critics see it as confrontation. But either way, it gets attention. And in this case, it created a collision course. Because on one side stood Donald Trump, a political figure known for applying pressure. On the other stood Mark Carney, a leader increasingly being asked by Canadians whether he was willing to push back. Sooner or later, those two realities were going to collide. And when they finally did, the result instantly dominated headlines. But here's the part most people missed. The viral moment wasn't actually the beginning of the story. It was the result of a story that had already been unfolding for months. The cameras only captured the explosion. They didn't capture the pressure building inside the room beforehand. Because behind the dramatic headlines, behind the clips spreading across social media, and behind the phrase that everybody was suddenly talking about, there was a much larger battle taking place. A battle over trade, influence, political leverage, and ultimately, who was willing to blink first. And once you understand that part of the story, the confrontation starts making a lot more sense. Because what looked like a single emotional moment may actually have been the breaking point of something much larger. And what happened next would pull politicians, journalists, investors, and millions of ordinary people directly into the middle of the fight. To many people watching the confrontation unfold, it looked sudden, a single moment, a single exchange, a single headline. But the truth was far more complicated. Because this story didn't begin inside that room. It began months earlier. Long before the cameras arrived, tensions between Canada and the United States had already been growing. Trade disagreements resurfaced. Economic concerns intensified. Political rhetoric became sharper, and both governments increasingly found themselves defending very different priorities. For the United States, the focus was often framed around economic advantage, protecting domestic industries, securing favorable trade terms, using leverage to achieve stronger negotiating positions. It was an approach that Donald Trump had embraced for years. Supporters argued it worked. Critics argued it created instability, but nobody could deny it generated results and attention. For Canada, the conversation looked different. Many Canadians weren't just debating economics. They were debating independence, national interests, and whether their government was doing enough to stand up for them when pressure came from outside the country. That distinction mattered. Because once economic disputes become tied to national identity, emotions become much stronger. And those emotions had been building. Every new disagreement added another layer. Every new headline added more frustration. Every new negotiation became another test of patience. Publicly, leaders continued speaking diplomatically. The language remained professional, the statements remained measured, the relationship remained officially cooperative. But beneath the surface, many observers could see the strain, because diplomacy often looks calm on camera, while intense disagreements happen behind closed doors. And according to political analysts following the situation, those disagreements were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. That's why the confrontation resonated with so many people. Not because it introduced a brand new conflict, but because it gave visible form to tensions people already knew existed. In many ways, the moment felt like a release valve. Something that had been building finally found a public expression. And once that happened, the story took on a life of its own. News organizations quickly began connecting the confrontation to broader disputes between the two countries. Questions about trade, questions about economic leverage, questions about future negotiations, questions about how both governments plan to move forward. Suddenly, the discussion wasn't only about what had been said, it was about what it meant. And that interpretation depended entirely on who was watching. Supporters of Carney saw a leader refusing to be pushed around. Supporters of Trump saw a leader defending American interests and facing unnecessary criticism. Both sides believed they were witnessing strength. Both sides believed they were protecting national interests. And because of that, the confrontation immediately became larger than the people involved. It became symbolic. A political clash transformed into a story about leadership, about pressure, about resistance, and about what happens when two very different approaches to power collide in public. But if the confrontation itself captured attention, what happened afterward would send the story into an entirely different level of visibility. Because now everyone wanted the answer to one question: how would Trump respond? The confrontation was over, but the story was just beginning. Because in today's political world, a moment doesn't stay inside a room for very long. Not when cameras are rolling, not when social media is watching, and certainly not when Donald Trump is involved. Within hours, clips of the confrontation began spreading across the internet. Political commentators jumped into the debate. News organizations rushed to cover the fallout. And millions of people who had never heard about the dispute suddenly wanted to know exactly what had happened. The story was everywhere. Some viewers saw the confrontation as a rare moment of resistance. Others viewed it as an unnecessary escalation. And many people weren't interested in choosing sides at all. They simply wanted to understand why this particular exchange had generated so much attention. That curiosity helped fuel the story even further. Because viral political moments follow a familiar pattern. First comes the event, then comes the reaction, then comes the argument. And once the argument starts, the audience grows, fast. That's exactly what happened here. Supporters of Carney began praising what they viewed as a willingness to stand firm under pressure. Supporters of Trump argued that strength and negotiation had once again become the center of the conversation. Commentators from every direction offered their own interpretation. And suddenly, a confrontation between two leaders had become an international debate. The media reaction only accelerated the process. Political panels discussed it, opinion writers analyzed it, television hosts debated it, and online creators began producing their own breakdowns almost immediately. Because stories like this are irresistible. They contain conflict, emotion, personalities, and consequences. Everything that drives attention. But while most people focused on the confrontation itself, others began focusing on something else: the potential fallout. Because public confrontations between national leaders rarely exist in isolation. They often influence future negotiations, future conversations, and future decisions. That possibility quickly became part of the discussion. Analysts started asking whether tensions between the two countries could become more difficult to manage. Could negotiations become harder? Could political pressure increase? Could future disputes become even more public? Nobody had clear answers. But the questions alone were enough to keep the story alive. And then came the next major phase. People wanted to know how Trump would handle the attention. Because regardless of political opinion, Trump has spent years demonstrating an ability to shape headlines. Critics point to it constantly, but everyone recognizes it, which meant the spotlight was now firmly fixed on his next move. The confrontation had transformed into something larger than a single exchange. It had become a test of narrative control. Who would define the story? Who would control public perception? Who would emerge looking stronger when the news cycle finally moved on? Those questions became almost as important as the confrontation itself. And while politicians debated the politics, another group had quietly started paying attention: investors, business leaders, and financial analysts. Because once politics starts creating uncertainty, money starts watching. For most people, the confrontation was political, a dramatic clash between two powerful figures, a viral moment, a headline. But for investors, it was something else entirely. It was uncertainty. And uncertainty has a way of attracting attention very quickly, because markets don't react to emotions. They react to risk. They react to unpredictability. They react to anything that could potentially alter the future business environment. And when tensions emerge between two countries as economically connected as Canada and the United States, people in the financial world pay attention. That doesn't mean panic, it doesn't mean crisis, and it certainly doesn't mean economic disaster. But it does mean questions start appearing. Questions about trade, questions about negotiations, questions about future relations between governments, questions about whether today's political conflict could become tomorrow's economic problem. Those questions matter, because Canada and the United States aren't just neighbors, they're deeply connected economic partners. Every day, goods move across the border, energy moves across the border, investment moves across the border. Businesses on both sides depend on stability, which means even a political confrontation can create ripple effects. That's why financial analysts began examining the broader implications of the story, not necessarily because they expected immediate consequences, but because perception itself can influence decision-making. And perception was now becoming part of the equation. Businesses were watching, investors were watching, policy experts were watching. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Was this simply another political headline, or was it the beginning of a more serious shift? The answer wasn't obvious, and that's exactly why attention remained so high, because uncertainty creates demand for information. People want clarity, markets want clarity, governments want clarity, yet clarity was in short supply. Instead, there were competing narratives. One narrative suggested the confrontation represented strength, another suggested it represented growing instability. One side viewed it as necessary, the other viewed it as damaging. The story grew even larger. Meanwhile, media organizations continued covering every new development. Political commentators continued debating every reaction, and audiences continued choosing sides. The confrontation had become more than a news event. It had become a symbol of a larger debate taking place across politics, economics, and public opinion. And that's when an even bigger question began emerging. Not what happened, not who said what, not who won the exchange, but what happens next. Because eventually, every confrontation reaches a turning point. The attention fades, the headlines move on, and reality takes over. Negotiations continue, governments make decisions, consequences begin to appear. That's the stage where political theater ends and real-world outcomes begin. And for both Canada and the United States, that stage was approaching fast, because the most important part of this story wasn't the confrontation itself. The most important part was what the confrontation might mean for the future. At some point, every political storm faces the same test. The headlines fade, the cameras leave, the social media debates slow down, and reality takes over. That's where this story was heading next. Because while millions of people were debating the confrontation, governments still had work to do. Trade discussions didn't disappear. Economic concerns didn't disappear. Diplomatic relationships didn't disappear. The news cycle may have focused on conflict, but governing requires something very different: solutions. That's what makes moments like this so fascinating. Public confrontations generate attention, private negotiations determine outcomes, and those two worlds don't always move in the same direction. In fact, sometimes the loudest political moments have very little long-term impact, while quieter decisions end up shaping history. That's why analysts quickly shifted their focus away from the confrontation itself and toward its consequences. Would relations between Canada and the United States become more strained? Would negotiations become more difficult? Would political pressure increase on both leaders? Or would the entire controversy eventually fade into the background? Those questions matter far more than a single headline, because despite the tension, both countries remain deeply connected, economically, politically, strategically. Neither side can simply ignore the other, and that's why many observers expected the relationship to continue moving forward despite the public friction. The real question wasn't whether cooperation would continue. The real question was under what conditions. Meanwhile, both leaders faced a different challenge: public perception. Because once a confrontation captures international attention, people start forming lasting impressions. Supports look for signs of strength. Critics look for signs of weakness, and every future decision becomes part of that larger narrative. That's the reality of modern politics. Moments become symbols, symbols become narratives, and narratives can shape public opinion long after the original event is forgotten. That's exactly why this confrontation attracted so much attention in the first place. People weren't just watching two leaders disagree, they were watching two competing visions of leadership collide. One side emphasized pressure and leverage, the other emphasized resistance and sovereignty. One side argued strength, the other side argued independence, and because both messages resonated with different audiences, the story continued growing long after the confrontation ended. But eventually, every viral story reaches the same destination: reality. The headlines stop, the debates cool down, the attention moves elsewhere, and what remains are the actual consequences. Not the reactions, not the outrage, not the clips. The consequences. That's why the next chapter may end up being more important than the confrontation itself. Because history rarely remembers who generated the biggest headline. History remembers what changed afterward. And that's the question still hanging over this story today. Did this confrontation change anything? Or was it simply a dramatic moment in an already complicated relationship? The answer may determine whether this story is remembered months from now or forgotten by next week. Before this story fades into the next news cycle, there's one final piece that deserves attention. Because the reason this confrontation exploded across television, social media, political commentary, and international news may not be the reason most people think. It wasn't a complex trade policy, it wasn't an economic report, and it wasn't a major government announcement. And human stories travel farther than policy discussions ever will. Think about what people actually saw. On one side, a leader known for applying pressure. On the other, a leader appearing unwilling to back down. You don't need to understand trade negotiations to understand that dynamic. You don't need to follow politics every day to understand conflict. And you certainly don't need to be Canadian or American to understand the idea of standing your ground. That's why the story spread so quickly. People instantly understood the emotional narrative: pressure, resistance, conflict, defiance. Those themes exist everywhere: politics, business, sports, history, even entertainment. The details may change, but the emotional structure remains the same. That's what transformed this confrontation from a political story into a viral story. Millions of people weren't analyzing policy. They were reacting to symbolism. Some saw courage, some saw recklessness. Some saw ego. And because different people saw different things, the debate never really ended. In many ways, that may be the most important lesson from this entire story. Political moments become powerful when people attach meaning to them. The event matters, but the interpretation matters even more. And once millions of people begin projecting their own beliefs onto a story, that story takes on a life of its own. That's exactly what happened here. The confrontation stopped belonging to politicians. It stopped belonging to governments, and it started belonging to the audience. Everyone began deciding for themselves what the moment represented, and that's when a news story becomes something bigger. Because ultimately, people may disagree about what happened. They may disagree about who was right. They may disagree about who benefited. But almost nobody disagrees on one thing. The confrontation captured attention. Attention is one of the most valuable forms of power there is, which is why this story continues generating debate long after the original moment ended, and why the next chapter may prove even more important than the confrontation that started it all. For now, the headlines will eventually move on. The news cycle always does. New controversies will emerge, new political battles will dominate attention, and new stories will compete for the public's focus. But moments like this tend to linger, because people remember confrontations, people remember reactions, and people remember moments that feel larger than the events themselves. Whether this confrontation ultimately changes anything between Canada and the United States remains to be seen. Whether it strengthens either leader politically remains to be seen. And whether history remembers it as a turning point or simply another dramatic political moment, only time will tell. But one thing is certain: millions of people around the world were watching the same story unfold. Supporters, critics, journalists, politicians, investors, ordinary viewers, all looking at the same event and drawing completely different conclusions. And perhaps that's what made the story so powerful in the first place. Because regardless of where people stood politically, everyone was paying attention. And in today's world, attention is power. Thank you for watching USA News Now. I'm Daniel Mercer, and if you enjoyed this breakdown, be sure to subscribe for more daily political news, geopolitical developments, and the stories shaping headlines around the world. Until next time, we'll be watching what happens next.